The numbers can be pretty overwhelming. But you hear the same story again and again. A species gets moved, maybe deliberately, and the place it lands, well, it often pays a huge price. We're talking about invasive species today, specifically freshwater fish. It's a massive global issue causing just colossal biodiversity loss and economic damage.
Absolutely colossal. You just have to look at some examples.
Right, like Nile perch and Lake Victoria.
Yeah.
That one introduction wiped out something like 200 native fish species.
Yeah, haplochromian cichlids. An
Unbelievable.
incredible loss, ecologically speaking, in just decades.
Or think about zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. Totally changed the game economically and environmentally. It's a major driver of global change.
It really is. And that's why today we want to sort of cut through some of that complexity. We're going to dig into what really drives invasion success, focusing on fish. Our guide for this deep dive is a paper from 2007 by García Berthou titled "The Characteristics of Invasive Fishes: What Has Been Learned So Far." It synthesizes 12 quantitative studies, which was a really big deal back then. Invasive species research was exploding, but solid quantitative work on fish specifically, that was lagging a bit until the years right before this paper.
So what's the big picture importance here? Why focus on prediction?
Well, predicting future invaders is obviously useful for conservation, trying to stop the next big problem before it starts.
Good
It's
point.
also like a unique scientific opportunity. These invasions are almost like experiments in nature. They let us test core ecological ideas in the real world.
Okay, let's unpack this. The paper really stresses that invasion isn't just one moment, right? It's a sequence. You have to look at each step on its own, because what helps at one stage might actually be a disadvantage later on.
Exactly, it's a pipeline.
And they break it down into 5 phases.
Yep, first is transport, T, getting to the new place. Then release, R, escaping or being put into the wild.
Good.
Third is establishment, E, surviving and reproducing. Then dispersal, D, spreading out. And finally, integration, I, which is really about the impact on the new ecosystem.
T-R-E-D-I. Got it.
And that sequence is precisely the challenge. A trait, say, being really bold and mobile, might help you spread fast the D phase.
Right.
But maybe it makes you easier to catch during transport. So there are trade-offs. But the biggest hurdle, the paper points out, honestly, it's often just bad data, especially for the early steps.
The data problem.
Yeah, transport and release. They're quick, they're messy, often poorly documented, and crucially, people rarely record the failures.
Ones that didn't make it.
Exactly. So if you only study the successful invaders, you've got this huge bias baked into your analysis from the start. You're only looking at the winners.
So where did that leave the research focus historically, if the early data is bad?
It meant most studies piled onto the establishment phase, the E, because, well, it's easier to see if a population is actually surviving and reproducing. You can go out and check.
Makes sense.
But the critical start and endpoints, transport, release, and especially impact, they ended up being much less understood, even though, they're arguably the most important for prevention and managing the consequences.
Okay, so let's get into those findings. Transport and release, the TR stages. The paper says it's not just random luck who gets moved.
Definitely not random. The synthesis showed success here is actually highly predictable.
And what predicts it?
3 main things top out. Taxonomy, basically, what family the fish belongs to, human affiliation or interest, whether we like it for some reason, and fish size.
Human interest. So we're talking about deliberate introductions again, not just stowaways.
Very much so. Humans pick fish for specific reasons. For sport, think largemouth bass moved everywhere. For food, common carp is a classic example. Or even things like mosquito control. That's why mosquito fish are global.
Right.
And that deliberate choosing creates a huge taxonomic bias. Certain fish families are just way overrepresented among invaders because, well, we keep picking them and moving them around.
But wait, if humans are picking species based on things like size or how good they are for fishing, doesn't that make the whole analysis of what traits make a good invader a bit circular?
That's a really sharp point, and the paper definitely tackles it.
Okay.
When they compared the established non-native fish to the native fish already in those locations, they found something interesting. The invasive group showed greater variability.
More variety in the invaders.
Yeah, a more diverse set of life history traits, things like growth rate, diet, reproduction. And this diversity often comes from what the author calls the ill-conceived idea of filling vacant niches.
The idea that we can Somehow improved nature by adding something new.
Exactly. People deliberately introduced fish that were bigger or grew faster or ate different things than the natives, hoping to, optimize the lake for fishing or whatever. So the invasive pool ends up being inherently more varied than the local species, which are already adapted to that specific environment.
Okay, that makes sense. So that brings us to the middle stage, establishment, the E. The fish are there. They're a varied bunch thanks to us. What determines if they actually take hold and start reproducing? Is it traits again? Or just luck with the environment?
Well, this is where the picture gets a lot fuzzier. The conclusions for establishment are way less clear-cut. It seems to be very context-dependent, lots of factors involved.
Like what kinds of factors?
Things like reproductive variables providing parental care often seems to help. Having a broad diet being a generalist feeder is usually good. And certain environmental tolerances, like handling wide temperature swings or different salinity levels.
But why are the results so mixed for this stage? It seems like the most studied one.
Yeah, and the likely reason ties right back to that human selection we were just talking about. Freshwater fish, compared to, say, insects or plants, tend to have really high establishment rates because they were often intentionally introduced, sometimes in large numbers.
Ah, so we basically give them a huge head start.
Exactly. We pre-select species we think will do well, and then we often introduce a lot of them. That initial boost, that high propagule pressure we'll talk about later, might mean the research is actually underestimating how important environmental barriers normally are.
Because we're essentially forcing them past those barriers.
Kind of. If you throw enough fish and enough effort into a new place, you can sometimes overcome the natural filters that would stop a smaller, accidental introduction.
Okay, let's move down the pipeline then. Dispersal, D, and impact. The paper says these are the least studied.
That's right. Especially quantitative studies on what traits predict spread and impact. Very few existed at the time of the review.
But for the impact phase, the consequences there was one really key finding, right? Something important for conservation. What makes an invader truly disruptive?
Yes, this was fascinating. The high-impact invaders, the ones really shaking up the ecosystem and displacing native species, they were significantly more likely to belong to genera not already present in that system.
Genera not present. So
Yeah.
taxonomically very different from the natives.
Exactly. It's about novelty. If you introduce a fish, even a really competitive one, from a genus that already has relatives living there, the ecosystem sort of has some existing tools to deal with it. Predators, diseases, competitors might be partially adapted.
Okay, there's some pre-existing context.
Right. But if you bring in something from a completely new genus, a type of organism the native species have literally never encountered before in their evolutionary history, that's when you get the biggest shock to the system.
Wow. So taxonomy isn't just about who gets introduced, it's also about who causes the most damage later on.
Precisely. It plays a role right at the beginning and again at the very end, in the impact phase.
This synthesis drew on 12 studies, which sounds pretty solid. But the paper itself points out some big methodological issues. What were the main limitations of the data they were working with?
A major one was geography. Every single one of those 12 studies looked at freshwater fish in basically Europe and North America.
Only the Northern Hemisphere, temperate zones.
Exactly. Which means any predictive model built from that data, well, you have to be really cautious applying it somewhere like the Amazon or Southeast Asia or Africa.
Right, the factors driving success in a cold European lake might be totally irrelevant in a tropical river.
Totally irrelevant. It's a huge geographic blind spot. We desperately need more comparative studies across different latitudes and regions. That's a major takeaway.
What about the statistics? How are these studies analyzing the data?
That was another big point of critique. The number of predictor variables they tested varied wildly. Some looked at only 3 traits, others up to 27. And the statistical methods used were often, let's say, older techniques.
Like what?
Mostly sequential methods like stepwise regression. These were common, but they have known flaws. One big one is dealing with multicollinearity.
Multicollinearity. Can you break that down for us? Why is that a problem here?
Sure, imagine you want to know if invasion success depends on, say, how big the fish gets or how many eggs it lays. But maybe in your data, big fish always lay lots of eggs. The variables are linked. They're collinear.
Okay, they move together.
Right. Stepwise methods struggle to untangle that overlap. They often force the analysis to pick just one variable as the best predictor, even if multiple factors are working together. It can give you a misleadingly simple picture of a really complex process.
So researchers were using tools maybe not quite right for teasing apart multiple interacting causes.
That's the argument. The paper strongly advocates for using information theoretic IT approaches, usually based on something called Akaike's Information Criterion, or AIC.
AAC, how does that help?
It's much better suited for observational ecology like this. It doesn't assume there's one single true model. Instead, it lets you compare the strength of evidence for multiple plausible models at the same time.
So you can see, okay, temperature matters this much and diet matters this much, even if they interact.
Exactly. It gives you a much more nuanced understanding of multivariate causality, which is almost always what's happening in ecology.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, you mentioned it earlier, there's one huge factor that influences success but is almost always missing from the data.
Yes. The elephant in the room. Propagule pressure.
Which is just how many get introduced.
Basically, yeah. It's the number of introduction events, or the sheer number of individual fish released. We know, just from basic principles, that dumping 1 million fish into a lake is more likely to lead to establishment than releasing just 10, regardless of their traits.
But we just don't know those numbers.
Very rarely, especially for fish, it's consistently the most poorly known factor. Researchers often have to rely on really rough proxies, like looking at whether a species has invaded other places successfully as a stand-in for knowing how much effort went into this introduction.
And we don't know who's doing the introducing a lot of the time either.
Often not. Unauthorized releases, illegal transport, escapes from fish farms or ponds. That data is incredibly hard to capture reliably.
Okay, so summing this all up, where does this leave researchers now? The paper called for some big shifts in focus, right?
Definitely. The main message was, we need to move beyond just studying establishment, that middle phase. It's relatively data-rich compared to the others.
So focus on the start and the end of the pipeline.
Exactly. Priority needs to shift to transport, release, or introduction, and impact. We need much better data on the actual mechanics of introduction. How are these fish moving? Who's selling them? How often are they escaping? We need to understand the pathways.
Like the pet trade or aquaculture.
Yes, and things like live bait release, illegal stocking, all those human activities driving the T and R phases.
And what about scale?
Crucial point. Future studies need to integrate across different scales. The paper suggests the drainage basin or catchment is probably the right ecological unit to be comparing, not just individual lakes or river segments.
Thinking bigger picture.
And as we said, comparing across different continents, different climate zones, we can't keep relying on just North American and European data to make global predictions.
So ultimately, the dream of finding a universal profile of a successful invader, maybe that's not realistic.
Probably not. The paper strongly suggests that accurate predictions will likely need to be taxon-specific. Different traits matter for different fish families, and region-specific.
What works in the Great Lakes won't necessarily work in the Mekong Delta.
Precisely. A super invader blueprint is likely a fantasy. The context matters enormously.
That's a really important takeaway, embracing the complexity. Okay, I'll leave you, our listeners, with this final thought from the deep dive. García Berthou's work brilliantly unpacks how fish succeed in invading, but it also flags a critical gap. We still know surprisingly little about the actual ecological impacts. Often what we think we know about impact reflects our human values. Does it hurt fishing? Does it cost money? Not necessarily objective measures of biodiversity loss or how the ecosystem actually functions. Bridging that gap, moving from predicting success to truly understanding ecological consequences, that seems like the urgent frontier.